Metzengerstein by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Metzengerstein by Edgar Allan Poe. Pestis eramus, moriens tua mors ero. Martin Luther. Horror and fatality have been stalking abroad in all ages. Why then give a date to this story I have to tell? Let it suffice to say that at the period of which I speak, there existed, in the interior of Hungary, a settled although hidden belief in the doctrines of the metempsychosis. Of the doctrines themselves, that is, of their falsity or of their probability, I say nothing. I assert, however, that much of our incredulity, as La Bruyère says, of all our unhappiness, vient de ne pouvoir être seul. But there are some points in the Hungarian superstition which were fast verging to absurdity. They, the Hungarians, differed very essentially from their Eastern authorities. For example, the soul, said the former, I give the words of an acute and intelligent Parisian, ne demeure qu'une seule fois dans un corps sensible. Au reste, un cheval, un chien, un homme même, n'est que la ressemblance peu tangible de ces animaux. The families of Berlifitzing and Metzengerstein had been at variance for centuries. Never before were two houses so illustrious, mutually embittered by hostility so deadly. The origin of this enmity seems to be found in the words of an ancient prophecy. A lofty name shall have a fearful fall, when as the rider over his horse, the mortality of Metzengerstein shall triumph over the immortality of Berlifitzing. To be sure, the words themselves had little or no meaning, but more trivial causes have given rise, and that no long while ago, to consequences equally eventful. Besides, the estates, which were contiguous, had long exercised a rival influence in the affairs of a busy government. Moreover, near neighbours are seldom friends, and the inhabitants of the castle Berlifitzing might look from their lofty buttresses into the very windows of the palace Metzengerstein. Least of all had the more than feudal magnificence, thus discovered, a tendency to allay the irritable feelings of the less ancient and less wealthy Berlifitzings. What wonder then that the words, however silly, of that prediction should have succeeded in setting and keeping at variance two families already predisposed to quarrel by every instigation of hereditary jealousy. The prophecy seemed to imply, if it implied anything, a final triumph on the part of the already more powerful house, and was of course remembered with a more bitter animosity by the weaker and less influential. Wilhelm, Count Berlifitzing, although loftily descended, was at the epoch of this narrative an infirm and doting old man, remarkable for nothing but an inordinate and inveterate personal antipathy to the family of his rival, and so passionate a love of horses and of hunting that neither bodily infirmity, great age, nor mental incapacity prevented his daily participation in the dangers of the chase. Frederick, Baron Metzengerstein, was on the other hand not yet of age. His father, the Minister G., died young. His mother, the Lady Mary, followed him quickly after. Frederick was at that time in his 15th year. In a city, 15 years are no long period. A child may be still a child in his third lustrum. But in a wilderness, in so magnificent a wilderness as that old principality, 15 years have a far deeper meaning. From some peculiar circumstances attending the administration of his father, the young Baron, at the decease of the former, entered immediately upon his vast possessions. Such estates were seldom held before by a nobleman of Hungary. His castles were without number. The chief in point of splendor and extent was the Chateau Metzengerstein. The boundary line of his dominion was never clearly defined, but his principal park embraced a circuit of 50 miles. Upon the succession of a proprietor so young, with a character so well known, to a fortune so unparalleled, little speculation was afloat in regard to his probable course of conduct. And indeed, for the space of 3 days, the behavior of the heir out-Heroded Herod, and fairly surpassed the expectations of his most enthusiastic admirers. Shameful debaucheries, flagrant treacheries, unheard-of atrocities, gave his trembling vassals quickly to understand that no servile submission on their part, no punctilios of conscience on his own, were thenceforward to prove any security against the remorseless fangs of the petty Caligula. On the night of the 4th day, the stables of the castle Berlifitzing were discovered to be on fire, and the unanimous opinion of the neighborhood added the crime of the incendiary to the already hideous list of the Baron's misdemeanors and enormities. But during the tumult occasioned by this occurrence, the young nobleman himself sat apparently buried in meditation, in a vast and desolate upper apartment of the family palace of Metzengerstein. The rich, although faded tapestry hangings, which swung gloomily upon the walls, represented the shadowy and majestic forms of 1,000 illustrious ancestors. Here rich ermine priests and pontifical dignitaries, familiarly seated with the autocrat and the sovereign, put a veto on the wishes of a temporal king, or restrained with the fiat of papal supremacy the rebellious sceptre of the arch-enemy. There, dark tall statues of the princes Metzengerstein, their muscular war coursers plunging over the carcasses of fallen foes, startled the steadiest nerves with their vigorous expression. And here again, the voluptuous and swan-like figures of the dames of days gone by floated away in the maze of an unreal dance to the strains of imaginary melody. But as the Baron listened, or affected to listen, to the gradually increasing uproar in the stables of Berlifitzing, or perhaps pondered upon some more novel, some more decided act of audacity, his eyes became unwittingly riveted to the figure of an enormous and unnaturally colored horse, represented in the tapestry as belonging to a Saracen ancestor of the family of his rival. The horse itself, in the foreground of the design, stood motionless and statue-like, while further back its discomfited rider perished by the dagger of Metzengerstein. On Frederick's lip arose a fiendish expression, as he became aware of the direction which his glance had without his consciousness assumed. Yet he did not remove it. On the contrary, he could by no means account for the overwhelming anxiety which appeared falling like a pall upon his senses. It was with difficulty that he reconciled his dreamy and incoherent feelings with the certainty of being awake. The longer he gazed, the more absorbing became the spell, the more impossible did it appear that he could ever withdraw his glance from the fascination of that tapestry. But the tumult without becoming suddenly more violent, with a compulsory exertion he diverted his attention to the glare of red light thrown full by the flaming stables upon the windows of the apartment. The action, however, was but momentary. His gaze returned mechanically to the wall. To his extreme horror and astonishment, the head of the gigantic steed had in the meantime altered its position. The neck of the animal before arched as if in compassion over the prostrate body of its lord, was now extended at full length in the direction of the Baron. The eyes, before invisible, now wore an energetic and human expression, while they gleamed with a fiery and unusual red, and the distended lips of the apparently enraged horse left in full view his gigantic and disgusting teeth. Stupefied with terror, the young nobleman tottered to the door. As he threw it open, a flash of red light, streaming far into the chamber, flung his shadow with a clear outline against the quivering tapestry, and he shuddered to perceive that shadow as he staggered awhile upon the threshold, assuming the exact position and precisely filling of the contour of the relentless and triumphant murderer of the Saracen Berlifitzing. To lighten the depression of his spirits, the Baron hurried into the open air. At the principal gate of the palace, he encountered 3 equerries. With much difficulty, and at the imminent peril of their lives, they were restraining the convulsive plunges of a gigantic and fiery-colored horse. "Whose horse? Where did you get him?" demanded the youth in a querulous and husky tone of voice, as he became instantly aware that the mysterious steed in the tapestried chamber was the very counterpart of the furious animal before his eyes. "He is your own property, sire," replied one of the equerries. "At least, he is claimed by no other owner. We caught him flying, all smoking and foaming with rage, from the burning stables of the castle Berlifitzing. Supposing him to have belonged to the old Count's stall of foreign horses, we led him back as an estray, but the grooms there disclaim any title to the creature, which is strange, since he bears evident marks of having made a narrow escape from the flames." "The letters WVB are also branded very distinctly on his forehead," interrupted a second equerry. "I suppose them, of course, to be the initials of Wilhelm von Berlifitzing, but all at the castle are positive in denying any knowledge of the horse." "Extremely singular," said the young Baron with a musing air, and apparently unconscious of the meaning of his words. "He is, as you say, a remarkable horse, a prodigious horse, although, as you very justly observe, of a suspicious and untractable character. Let him be mine, however," he added after a pause. "Perhaps a rider like Frederick of Metzengerstein may tame even the devil from the stable of Berlifitzing." "You are mistaken, my lord. The horse, as I think we mentioned, is not from the stables of the Count. If such had been the case, we know our duty better than to bring him into the presence of the noble of your family." "True," observed the Baron dryly, and at that instant a page of the bedchamber came from the palace with a heightened colour and a precipitate step. He whispered into his master's ear an account of the sudden disappearance of a small portion of the tapestry in an apartment which he designated, entering at the same time into particulars of a minute and circumstantial character, but from the low tone of voice in which these latter were communicated, nothing escaped to gratify the excited curiosity of the equerries. The young Frederick, during the conference, seemed agitated by a variety of emotions. He soon, however, recovered his composure, and an expression of determined malignancy settled upon his countenance, as he gave peremptory orders that a certain chamber should be immediately locked up, and the key placed in his own possession. "Have you heard of the unhappy death of the old hunter Berlifitzing?" said one of his vassals to the Baron, as after the departure of the page the huge steed which that nobleman had adopted as his own plunged and curveted with redoubled fury down the long avenue which extended from the chateau to the stables of Metzengerstein. "No," said the Baron, turning abruptly toward the speaker. Dead, say you? It is indeed true, my lord, and to a noble of your name will be, I imagine, no unwelcome intelligence. A rapid smile shot over the countenance of the listener. How died he? In his rash exertions to rescue a favourite portion of his hunting stud, he has himself perished miserably in the flames. Indeed, ejaculated the Baron, as if slowly and deliberately impressed with the truth of some exciting idea. Indeed, repeated the vassal. Shocking, said the youth calmly, and turned quietly into the chateau. From this date, a marked alteration took place in the outward demeanour of the dissolute young Baron Frederick von Metzengerstein. Indeed, his behaviour disappointed every expectation, and proved little in accordance with the views of many a manoeuvring mamma, while his habits and manner, still less than formerly, offered anything congenial with those of the neighbouring aristocracy. He was never to be seen beyond the limits of his own domain, and in this wide and social world was utterly companionless, unless indeed that unnatural, impetuous, and fiery-coloured horse, which he henceforward continually bestrode, had any mysterious right to the title of his friend. Numerous invitations on the part of the neighbourhood for a long time, however, periodically came in. Will the Baron honour our festivals with his presence? Will the Baron join us in the hunting of the boar? Metzengerstein does not hunt. Metzengerstein will not attend, were the haughty and laconic answers. These repeated insults were not to be endured by an imperious nobility. Such invitations became less cordial, less frequent. In time, they ceased altogether. The widow of the unfortunate Count Berlifitzing was even heard to express a hope that the Baron might be at home when he did not wish to be at home, since he disdained the company of his equals, and ride when he did not wish to ride, since he preferred the society of a horse. This, to be sure, was a very silly explosion of hereditary pique, and merely proved how singularly unmeaning our sayings are apt to become when we desire to be unusually energetic. The charitable, nevertheless, attributed the alteration in the conduct of the young nobleman to the natural sorrow of a son for the untimely loss of his parents, forgetting, however, his atrocious and reckless behaviour during the short period immediately succeeding that bereavement. Some there were indeed who suggested a too haughty idea of self-consequence and dignity. Others again, among them may be mentioned the family physician, did not hesitate in speaking of morbid melancholy and hereditary ill health, while dark hints of a more equivocal nature were current among the multitude. Indeed, the Baron's perverse attachment to his lately acquired charger, an attachment which seemed to attain new strength from every fresh example of the animal's ferocious and demon-like propensities, at length became, in the eyes of all reasonable men, a hideous and unnatural fervour, in the glare of noon, at the dead hour of night, in sickness or in health, in calm or in tempest. The young Metzengerstein seemed riveted to the saddle of that colossal horse, whose intractable audacities so well accorded with his own spirit. There were circumstances, moreover, which, coupled with late events, gave an unearthly and portentous character to the mania of the rider and to the capabilities of the steed. The space passed over in a single leap had been accurately measured, and was found to exceed by an astounding difference the wildest expectations of the most imaginative. The Baron, besides, had no particular name for the animal, although all the rest in his collection were distinguished by characteristic appellations. His stable, too, was appointed at a distance from the rest, and with regard to grooming and other necessary offices, None but the owner in person had ventured to officiate, or even to enter the enclosure of that particular stall. It was also to be observed that although the 3 grooms, who had caught the steed as he fled from the conflagration at Berlifitzing, had succeeded in arresting his course by means of a chain bridle and noose, yet no one of the 3 could with any certainty affirm that he had, during that dangerous struggle, or at any period thereafter, actually placed his hand upon the body of the beast. Instances of peculiar intelligence in the demeanour of a noble and high-spirited horse are not to be supposed capable of exciting unreasonable attention, especially among men who, daily trained to the labours of the chase, might appear well acquainted with the sagacity of a horse. But there were certain circumstances which intruded themselves perforce upon the most sceptical and phlegmatic. And it is said that there were times when the animal caused the gaping crowd who stood round to recoil in horror from the deep and impressive meaning of his terrible stamp, times when the young Metzengerstein turned pale and shrank away from the rapid and searching expression of his earnest and human-looking eye. Among all the retinue of the Baron, however, none were found to doubt the ardour of that extraordinary affection which existed on the part of the young nobleman for the fiery qualities of his horse. At least, none but an insignificant and misshapen little page, whose deformities were in everybody's way, and whose opinions were of the least possible importance. He, if his ideas are worth mentioning at all, had the effrontery to assert that his master never vaulted into the saddle without an unaccountable and almost imperceptible shudder, that, upon his return from every long-continued and habitual ride, an expression of triumphant malignity distorted every muscle in his countenance. One tempestuous night, Metzengerstein, awaking from a heavy slumber, descended like a maniac from his chamber, and mounting in hot haste, bounded away into the mazes of the forest. An occurrence so common attracted no particular attention, but his return was looked for with intense anxiety on the part of his domestics, when after some hours' absence the stupendous and magnificent battlements of the Chateau Metzengerstein were discovered crackling and rocking to their very foundation under the influence of a dense and livid mass of ungovernable fire. As the flames, when first seen, had already made so terrible a progress that all efforts to save any portion of the building were evidently futile, the astonished neighborhood stood idly around in silence and pathetic wonder. But a new and fearful object soon riveted the attention of the multitude, and proved how much more intense is the excitement wrought in the feelings of the crowd by the contemplation of human agony, than that brought about by the most appalling spectacles of inanimate matter. Up the long avenue of aged oaks which led from the forest to the main entrance of the Chateau Metzengerstein, a steed bearing an unbonneted and disordered rider was seen leaping with an impetuosity which outstripped the very demon of the tempest. The career of the horseman was indisputably, on his own part, uncontrollable. The agony of his countenance, the convulsive struggle of his frame, gave evidence of superhuman exertion, but no sound, save a solitary shriek, escaped from his lacerated lips, which were bitten through and through with an intensity of terror. One instant, and the clattering of hoofs resounded sharply and shrilly above the roaring of the flames and the shrieking of the winds. Another, and, clearing at a single plunge the gateway and the moat, the steed bounded far up the tottering staircases of the palace. and with its rider disappeared amid a whirlwind of chaotic fire. The fury of the tempest immediately died away, and a dead calm suddenly succeeded. The white flame still enveloped the building like a shroud, and streaming far away into the quiet atmosphere, shot forth a glare of preternatural light, while a cloud of smoke settled heavily over the battlements in the distinct colossal figure of the horse. End of Metzengerstein. Recording by Natalie.
The Third Eye by Robert W. Chambers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Third Eye by Robert W. Chambers. Recording by Mark Nelson. Although the man's back was turned toward me, I was uncomfortably conscious that he was watching me. How he could possibly be watching me while I stood directly behind him, I did not ask myself. Yet, nevertheless, instinct warned me that I was being inspected, that somehow or other the man was staring at me as steadily as though he and I had been face to face, and his faded, sea-green eyes were focused upon me. It was an odd sensation which persisted in spite of logic, and of which I could not rid myself. Yet the little waitress did not seem to share it. Perhaps she was not under his glassy inspection. But then, of course, I could not be either. No doubt the nervous tension incident to the expedition was making me supersensitive and even morbid. Our sailboat rode the shallow turquoise-tinted waters at anchor, rocking gently just off the snowy coral reef on which we were now camping. The youthful waitress, who for economy's sake wore her cap, apron, collar, and cuffs over her dainty print dress, was seated by the signal fire writing in her diary. Sometimes she thoughtfully touched her pencil point with the tip of her tongue. Sometimes she replenished the fire from a pile of dead mangrove branches heaped up on the coral reef beside her. Whatever she did, she accomplished gracefully. As for the man, Gru, his back remained turned toward us both, and he continued, apparently, to scan the horizon for the sail which we all expected. And all the time I could not rid myself of the unpleasant idea that somehow or other he was looking at me, watching attentively the expression of my features and noting my every movement. The smoke of our fire blew wide across leagues of shallow, sparkling water, or, when the wind veered, whirled back into our faces across the reef, curling and eddying among the standing mangroves like fog drifting. Seated there near the fire, from time to time I swept the horizon with my marine glasses, but there was no sign of Kemper. No sail broke the far sweep of sky and water. Nothing moved out there, save when a wild duck took wing amid the dark raft of its companions, to circle low above the ocean and settle at random, invisible again except when, at intervals, its white breast flashed in the sunshine. Meanwhile, the waitress had ceased to write in her diary, and now sat with the closed book on her knees and her pencil resting against her lips, gazing thoughtfully at the back of Gru's head. It was a ratty head of straight black hair, and looked greasy. The rest of him struck me as equally unkempt and dingy. A youngish man, lean, deeply bitten by the sun of the semi-tropics to a mahogany hue, and unusually hairy. I don't mind a brawny, hairy man, but the hair on Gru's arms and chest was a rusty red, and like a chimpanzee's in texture, and sometimes a wildly absurd idea possessed me that the man needed it when he went about in the palm forests without his clothes. But he was only a poor white, a cracker, recruited from one of the reefs near Pelican Light, where he lived alone by fishing and selling his fish to the hotels at Heliotrope City. The sailboat was his. He figured as our official guide on this expedition, an expedition which already had begun to worry me a great deal. For it was, perhaps, the wildest goose chase and the most absurdly hopeless enterprise ever undertaken in the interest of science by the Bronx Park authorities. Nothing is more dreaded by scientists than ridicule, and it is in spite of this terror of ridicule that I summoned sufficient courage to organize an exploring party and start out in search of something so extraordinary, so hitherto unheard of, that I had not dared reveal to Kemper by letter the object of my quest. No, I did not care to commit myself to writing just yet. I had merely sent Kemper a letter to join me on Stingray Key. He telegraphed me from Tampa that he would join me at the rendezvous, and I started directly from Bronx Park for Heliotrope City. Arrived there in 3 days, found the waitress all ready to start with me, inquired about a guide, and discovered the man Grew in his hut off Pelican Light. Made my bargain with him, and set sail for Stingray Key, the most excited and the most nervous young man who ever had dared disaster in the sacred cause of science. Everything was now at stake. My honor, reputation, career, fortune. For, as chief of the Anthropological Field Survey Department of the Great Bronx Park Zoological Society, I was perfectly aware that no scientific reputation can survive ridicule. Nevertheless, the die had been cast, the Rubicon crossed in a sailboat containing one beachcombing cracker, one hotel waitress, a pile of camping kit and special utensils, and myself. How was I going to tell Kemper? How was I going to confess to him that I was staking my reputation as an anthropologist upon a letter or two and a personal interview with a young girl, a waitress at the Hotel Gardenia in Heliotrope City? I lowered my sea-glasses and glanced sideways at the waitress. She was still chewing the end of her pencil reflectively. She was a pretty girl, one Evelyn Gray, and had been a country schoolteacher in Massachusetts until her health broke. Florida was what she required, but that healing climate was possible to her only if she could find there a self-supporting position. Also, she had nourished an ambition for a postgraduate education, with further aspirations to a government appointment in the Smithsonian Institute. All very worthy, no doubt. In fact, particularly commendable, because the wages she saved as a waitress in a Florida hotel during the winter were her only means of support while studying for college examinations during the summer in Boston, where she lived. Yet, although she was an inmate of Massachusetts, her face and figure would have ornamented any light opera stage. I never looked at her, but I thought so, and her cuffs and apron merely accentuated the delusion. Such ankles are seldom seen when the curtain rises after the overture. Odd that frivolous thoughts could flit through an intellect dedicated only to science. The man, Grew, had not stirred from his survey of the Atlantic Ocean. He had a somewhat disturbing capacity for remaining motionless, like a stealthy and predatory bird, which depends on immobility for aggressive and defensive existence. The sea wind fluttered his cotton shirt and trousers and the tattered brim of his straw hat. And always I felt as though he were watching me out of the back of his ratty head, through the ravelled straw brim that sagged over his neck. The pretty waitress had now chewed the end of her pencil to a satisfactory pulp, and she was writing again in her diary, very intently, so that my cautious touch on her arm seemed to startle her. Meeting her inquiring eyes, I said in a low voice, "I am not sure why, but I don't seem to care very much for that man Grew. Do you?" She glanced at the water's edge, where Grew stood, immovable, his back still turned to us. "I never liked him," she said under her breath. "Why?" I asked cautiously. She merely shrugged her shoulders. She did it gracefully. I said, "Have you any particular reason for disliking him?" "He's dirty." "He looks dirty, yet every day he goes into the sea and swims about. He ought to be clean enough." She thought for a moment, then, "He seems, somehow, to be fundamentally unclean. I don't mean that he doesn't wash himself, but there are certain sorts of animals and birds and other creatures from which one instinctively shrinks, not perhaps because they are materially unclean." "I understand," I said. After a silence, I added, "Well, there's no chance now of sending him back, even if I were inclined to do so. He appears to be familiar with these latitudes. I don't suppose we could find a better man for our purpose, do you?" "No. He was a sponge fisher once, I believe." "Did he tell you so?" "No. But yesterday, when you took the boat and cruised to the south, I sat writing here and keeping up the fire, and I saw Gru climbing about among the mangroves over the water in a most uncanny way, and two snake-birds sat watching him, and they never moved. He didn't seem to see them. His back was toward them. And then, all at once, he leaped backward at them where they sat on the mangrove, and he got one of them by the neck." "What?" The girl nodded. "By the neck," she repeated, "and down they went into the water. And what do you suppose happened?" "I can't imagine," said I with a grimace. "Well, Gru went under, still clutching the squirming, flapping bird, and he stayed under." "Stayed under the water?" "Yes, longer than any sponge diver I ever heard of. And I was becoming frightened when the bloody bubbles and feathers began to come up." "What was he doing under the water?" "He must have been tearing the bird to pieces. Oh, it was quite unpleasant, I assure you, Mr. Smith. And when he came up and looked at me out of those very vitreous eyes, he resembled something horridly amphibious. And I felt rather sick and dizzy." "He's got to stop that sort of thing," I said angrily. "Snake birds are harmless, and I won't have him killing them in that barbarous fashion. I've warned him already to let birds alone. I don't know how he catches them or why he kills them, but he seems to have a mania for doing it." I was interrupted by Gru's soft and rather pleasant voice from the water's edge, announcing a sail on the horizon. He did not turn when speaking. The next moment I made out the sail and focused my glasses on it. "It's Professor Kemper," I announced presently. "I'm so glad," remarked Evelyn Gray. I don't know why it should have suddenly occurred to me, apropos of nothing, that Billy Kemper was unusually handsome. Or why I should have turned and looked at the pretty waitress, except that she was, perhaps, worth gazing upon from a purely non-scientific point of view. In fact, to a man not entirely absorbed in scientific research, and not passionately and irrevocably wedded to his profession, her violet blue eyes and rather sweet mouth might have proved disturbing. As I was thinking about this, she looked up at me and smiled. It's a good thing, I thought to myself, that I am irrevocably wedded to my profession. And I gazed fixedly across the Atlantic Ocean. There was scarcely sufficient breeze of a steady character to bring Kemper to Stingray Key, but he got out his sweeps when I hailed him and came in at a lively clip, anchoring alongside of our boat and leaping ashore with that unnecessary dash and abandon which women find pleasing. Glancing sideways at my waitress through my spectacles, I found her looking into a small hand mirror and patting her hair with one slim and sun-tanned hand. When Professor Kemper landed on the coral, he shot a curious look at Gru, and then came striding across the reef to me. "Hello, Smithy," he said, holding out his hand. "Here I am, you see. Now, what's up?" Just then, Evelyn Gray got up from her seat beside the fire, and Kemper turned and gazed at her with every symptom of unfeigned approbation. I introduced him. Evelyn Gray seemed a trifle indifferent. A good-looking man doesn't last long with a clever woman. I smiled to myself, polishing my spectacles gleefully. Yet I had no idea why I was smiling. We three people turned and walked toward the comb of the reef. A solitary palm represented the island's vegetation, except, of course, for the water-growing mangroves. I asked Miss Gray to precede us and wait for us under the palm, and she went forward in that light-footed way of hers, which, to any non-scientific man, might have been a trifle disturbing. It had no effect upon me. Besides, I was looking at Gru, who had gone to the fire and was evidently preparing to fry our evening meal of fish and rice. I didn't like to have him cook, but I wasn't going to do it myself, and my pretty waitress didn't know how to cook anything more complicated than beans. We had no beans. Kemper said to me, "Why on earth did you bring a waitress?" "Not to wait on table," I replied, amused. "I'll explain her later. Meanwhile, I merely want to say that you need not remain with this expedition if you don't want to. It's optional with you." "That's a funny thing to say." "No, not funny. Sad. The truth is that if I fail, I'll be driven into obscurity by the ridicule of my brother scientists the world over. I had to tell them at the Bronx what I was going after. Every man connected with the society attempted to dissuade me, saying that the whole thing was absurd and that my reputation would suffer if I engaged in such a ridiculous quest. So when you hear what that girl and I are after out here in the semi-tropics, and when you're in possession of the only evidence I have to justify my credulity, if you want to go home, go, because I don't wish to risk your reputation as a scientist unless you choose to risk it yourself." He regarded me curiously. Then his eyes strayed toward the palm tree, which Evelyn Gray was now approaching. "All right," he said briefly. "Let's hear what's up." So we moved forward to rejoin the girl, who had already seated herself under the tree. She looked very attractive in her neat cuffs, tiny cap, and pink print gown as we approached her. "Why does she dress that way?" asked Kemper uneasily. "Economy. She desires to use up the habiliments of a service which there will be no necessity for her to re-enter if this expedition proves successful." "Oh. But, Smithy—" "What?" "Was it moral to bring a waitress?" "Perfectly," I replied sharply. "Science knows no sex." "I don't understand how a waitress can be scientific," he muttered, "and there seems to be no question about her possessing plenty of sex." "If that girl's conclusions are warranted," I interrupted coldly, "she is a most intelligent and clever person. I think they are warranted. If you don't, you may go home as soon as you like." I glanced at him. He was smiling at her with that strained politeness which alters the natural expression of men in the imminence of a conversation with a new and pretty woman. I often wonder what particular combination of facial muscles are brought into play when that politely receptive expression transforms the normal and masculine features into a fixed simper. When Kemper and I seated ourselves, I calmly cut short the small talk in which he was already indulging, and to which, I am sorry to say, my pretty waitress was beginning to respond. I had scarcely thought it of her, but that's neither here nor there, and I invited her to recapitulate the circumstances which had resulted in our present foregathering here on this strip of coral in the Atlantic Ocean. She did so very modestly and without embarrassment, stating the case and reviewing the evidence so clearly and so simply that I could see how every word she uttered was not only amazing, but also convincing Kemper. When she had ended, he asked a few questions very seriously. "Granted," he said, "that the pituitary gland represents what we assume it represents, how much faith is to be placed in the testimony of a Seminole Indian?" "A Seminole Indian," she replied, "has seldom or never been known to lie. And where a whole tribe testify alike the truth of what they assert cannot be questioned." "How did you make them talk? They are a sullen, suspicious people, haughty, uncommunicative, seldom even replying to an ordinary question from a white man." "They consider me one of them." "Why?" he asked in surprise. "I'll tell you why. It came about through a mere accident. I was waitress at the hotel. It happened to be my afternoon off, so I went down to the Coquina dock to study. I study in my leisure moments because I wish to fit myself for college examination." Her charming face became serious. She picked up the hem of her apron and continued to pleat it slowly and with precision as she talked. "There was a Seminole named Tiger Tail sitting there, his feet dangling above his moored canoe, evidently waiting for the tide to turn before he went out to spear crayfish. I merely noticed he was sitting there in the sunshine, that's all. And then I opened my mythology book and turned to the story of Argus, on which I was reading up. And this is what happened. There was a picture of the death of Argus, facing the printed page which I was reading. The well-known picture where Juno is holding the head of the decapitated monster. And I had read scarcely a dozen words in the book before the Seminole beside me leaned over and placed his forefinger squarely upon the head of Argus. "Who?" he demanded. I looked around good-humoredly and was surprised at the evident excitement of the Indian. They're not excitable, you know. "That," said I, "is a Greek gentleman named Argus." I suppose he thought I meant a Minorcan, for he nodded. Then, without further comment, he placed his finger on Juno. "Who?" he inquired emphatically. I said flippantly, "Oh, that's only my Aunt Juno." "Auntie of you?" "Yes." "She kill 'em 3-eye?" Argus had been depicted with 3 eyes. "Yes," I said, "my Aunt Juno had Argus killed." "Why kill 'em?" "Well, Auntie needed his eyes to set in the tails of the peacocks which drew her automobile, so when they cut off the head of Argus, my aunt had the eyes taken out, and that's a picture of how she set them into the peacock." "Auntie of you?" he repeated. "Certainly," I said gravely. "I am a direct descendant of the goddess of wisdom. That's why I'm always studying when you see me down on the dock here." "You Seminole!" he said emphatically. "Seminole?" I repeated, puzzled. "You Seminole! Anti-Seminole! You Seminole!" "Why, Tiger Tail?" "Seminole hunt 3-eye long time. 100 year. Hunt 'em 3-eye. Kill 'em 3-eye." "You say that for hundreds of years the Seminoles have hunted a creature with 3 eyes?" "Sure. Hunt 'em now." "Now?" "Sure." "But, Tiger Tail, if the legends of your people tell you that the Seminoles hunted a creature with 3 eyes hundreds of years ago, certainly no such 3-eyed creatures remain today." "Some." "What? Where?" "Black Bayou." "Do you mean to tell me that a living creature with 3 eyes still inhabits the forests of the Black Bayou?" "Sure. Me see 'em. Me kill 'em 3-eye man." "You have killed a man who had 3 eyes?" "Sure." "A man with 3 eyes?" "Sure." The pretty waitress, excitedly engrossed in her story, was unconsciously acting out the thrilling scene of her dialogue with the Indian, even imitating his voice and gestures. and Kemper and I listened and watched her breathlessly, fascinated by her lithe and supple grace, as well as by the astounding story she was so frankly unfolding with the consummate artlessness of a natural actress. She turned her flushed face to us. "I made up my mind," she said, "that Tiger Tail's story was worth investigating. It was perfectly easy for me to secure corroboration, because that Seminole went back to his Everglade camp and told every one of his people that I was a white Seminole, because my ancestors also hunted the three-eyed man, and nobody except a Seminole could know that such a thing as a three-eyed man existed. So the next afternoon off, I embarked in Tiger Tail's canoe, and he took me to his camp. And there I talked to his people, men and women, questioning, listening, putting this and that together, trying to discover some foundation for their persistent statements concerning men still living in the jungles of Black Bayou who had 3 eyes instead of 2. All told the same story. All asserted that since the time their records ran, the Seminoles had hunted and slain every three-eyed man they could catch, and that as long as the Seminoles had lived in the Everglades, the three-eyed men had lived in the forests beyond Black Bayou. She paused dramatically, cooling her cheeks in her palms and looking from Kemper to me with eyes made starry by excitement. "And what do you think?" she continued under her breath. "To prove what they said, they brought for my inspection a skull, and then 2 more skulls like the first one. Every skull had been painted with Spanish red, the coarse black hair still stuck to the scalps. And behind, just over where the pituitary gland is situated, was a hollow, bony orbit, unmistakably the socket of a 3rd eye." "Where are those skulls?" demanded Kemper, in a voice not entirely under control. "They wouldn't part with one of them. I tried every possible persuasion. On my own responsibility, and even before I communicated with Mr. Smith," turning toward me, "I offered them $20,000 for a single skull, staking my word of honor that the Bronx Museum would pay that sum. It was useless. Not only do the Seminoles refuse to part with one of those skulls, but I have also learned that I am the first person with a white skin who has ever even heard of their existence. So profoundly have these red men of the Everglades guarded their secret through the centuries." After a silence, Kemper, rather pale, remarked, "This is a most astonishing business, Miss Gray." "What do you think about it?" I demanded. "Is it not worthwhile for us to explore Black Bayou?" He nodded in a dazed sort of way, but his gaze remained riveted on the girl. Presently he said, "Why does Miss Gray go?" She turned in surprise. "Why am I going? But it is my discovery. My contribution to science, isn't it?" "Certainly," we exclaimed warmly and in unison. And Kemper added, "I was only thinking of the dangers and hardships. Smith and I could do the actual work." "Oh," she cried in quick protest, "I wouldn't miss one moment of the excitement, one pain, one pang. I love it. It would simply break my heart not to share every chance, hazard, danger of this expedition, every atom of hope, excitement, despair, uncertainty, and the ultimate success, the unsurpassable thrill of exultation in the final instant of triumph." She sprang to her feet in a flash of uncontrollable enthusiasm, and stood there, aglow with courage and resolution, making a highly agreeable picture in her apron and cuffs, the sea wind fluttering the bright tendrils of her hair under her dainty cap. We got to our feet much impressed, and now absolutely convinced that there did exist, somewhere, descendants of prehistoric men in whom the 3rd eye, placed in the back of the head for purposes of defensive observation, had not become obsolete and reduced to the traces which we know only as the pituitary body or pituitary gland. Kemper and I were, of course, aware that in the insect world the ocelli served the same purpose that the degenerate pituitary body once served in the occiput of a man. As we three walked slowly back to the campfire, where our evening meal was now ready, Evelyn Gray, who walked between us, told us what she knew about the hunting of these three-eyed men by the Seminoles, how intense was the hatred of the Indians for these people, how murderously they behaved toward any one of them whom they could track down and catch. Tiger Tail told me, she went on, that in all probability the strange race was nearing extinction, that all had not yet been exterminated, because now and then, when hunting along the Black Bayou, traces of living three-eyed men were still found by him and his people. No later than last week, Tiger Tail himself had startled one of these strange denizens of Black Bayou from a meal of fish, and had heard him leap through the bushes and plunge into the water. It appears that centuries of persecution have made these three-eyed men partly amphibious, that is, capable of filling their lungs with air and remaining under water almost as long as a turtle. "That's impossible," said Kemper bluntly. "I thought so myself," she said with a smile, "until Tiger Tail told me a little more about them. He says that they can breathe through the pores of their skins, that their bodies are covered with a thick silky hair, and that when they dive they carry down with them enough air to form a sort of skin over them, so that under water their bodies appear to be silver-plated." "Good Lord," faltered Kemper, "that is a little too much." "Yet," said I, "that is exactly what air-breathing water beetles do. The globules of air, clinging to the body hairs, appear to silver-plate them, and they can remain below indefinitely, breathing through spiracles. Doubtless the skin pores of these men have taken on the character of spiracles." "You know," he said in a curious flat voice, which sounded like the tones of a partly stupefied man, "this whole business is so grotesque, apparently so wildly absurd, that it's having a sort of nightmare effect on me." And dropping his voice to a whisper close to my ear, "Good heavens," he said, "can you reconcile such a creature as we are starting out to hunt with anything living known to science?" "No," I replied in guarded tones. "And there are moments, Kemper, since I have come into possession of Miss Gray's story, when I find myself seriously doubting my own sanity." "I'm doubting mine now," he whispered. "Only that girl is so fresh and wholesome and human and sane." "She is a very clever girl," I said. "And really beautiful." "She is intelligent," I remarked. There was a chill in my tone, which doubtless discouraged Kemper, for he ventured nothing further concerning her superficially personal attractions. After all, if any questions of priority were to arise, the pretty waitress was my discovery, and in the scientific world it is an inflexible rule that he who first discovers any particular specimen of any species whatever is first entitled to describe and comment upon that specimen without interference or unsolicited advice from anybody. Maybe there was in my eye something that expressed as much, for when Kemper caught my cold gaze fixed upon him he winced and looked away, like a reproved setter dog who knew better. Who also, for the moment, put an end to the rather gay and frivolous line of small talk which he had again begun with the pretty waitress. I was exceedingly surprised at Professor William Henry Kemper, D.F. As we approached the campfire, the loathsome odor of frying mullet saluted my nostrils. Kemper, glancing at Grew, said aside to me, "That's an odd-looking fellow. What is he, Minorcan?" "Oh, just a beachcomber. I don't know what he is. He strikes me as dirty, though he can't be so physically. I don't like him, and I don't know why. and I wish we'd engaged someone else to guide us. Toward dawn, something awoke me, and I sat up in my blanket under the moon. But my leg had not been pulled. Kemper snored at my side. In her little dog tent, the pretty waitress probably was fast asleep. I knew it because the string she had tied to one of her ornamental ankles still lay across the ground, convenient to my hand. In any emergency, I had only to pull it to awaken her. A similar string, tied to my ankle, ran parallel to hers and disappeared under the flap of her tent. This was for her to pull if she liked. She had never yet pulled it, nor I the other. Nevertheless, I truly felt that these humble strings were, in a subtler sense, ties that bound us together. No wonder Kemper's behavior had slightly irritated me. I looked at the silver moon. I glanced at Kemper's unlovely bulk, swathed in a blanket. I contemplated the dog tent with, perhaps, that slight trace of sentiment which a semi-tropical moon is likely to inspire even in a jellyfish. And suddenly I remembered Gru and looked for him. He was accustomed to sleep in his boat, but I did not see him in either of the boats. Here and there were a few lumpy shadows in the moonlight, but none of them was Gru lying prone on the ground. Where the devil had he gone? Cautiously, I untied my ankle string, rose in my pajamas, stepped into my slippers, and walked out through the moonlight. There was nothing to hide Gru, no rocks or vegetation except the solitary palm on the backbone of the reef. I walked as far as the tree and looked up into the arching fronds. Nobody was up there. I could see the moonlit sky through the fronds. Nor was Gru lying asleep anywhere on the other side of the coral ridge. And suddenly I became aware of all my latent distrust and dislike for the man, and the vigor of my sentiments surprised me because I really had not understood how deep and thorough my dislike had been. Also, his utter disappearance struck me as uncanny. Both boats were there, and there were many leagues of sea to the nearest coast. Troubled and puzzled, I turned and walked back to the dead embers of the fire. Kemper had merely changed the timbre of his snore to a whistling aria, which at any other time would have enraged me. Now, somehow, it almost comforted me. Seated on the shore, I looked out to the sea, racking my brains for an explanation of Gru's disappearance. And while I sat there racking them, far out on the water, a little flock of ducks suddenly scattered and rose with frightened quackings and furiously beating wings. For a moment I thought I saw a round, dark object on the waves where the flock had been. And while I sat there watching, up out of the sea, along the reef to my right, crawled a naked, dripping figure, holding a dead duck in his mouth. Fascinated, I watched it, recognizing Gru with his tarry black hair all plastered over his face. Whether he caught sight of me or not, I don't know, but he suddenly dropped the dead duck from his mouth, turned, and dived underwater. It was a grim and horrid species of sport or pastime, this amphibious business of his, catching wild birds and dragging them about as though he were an animal. Evidently he was ashamed of himself, for he had dropped the duck. I watched it floating by on the waves, its head under water. Suddenly something jerked it under, a fish perhaps, for it did not come up and float again as far as I could see. When I went back to camp, Gru lay apparently asleep on the north side of the fire. I glanced at him in disgust and crawled into my tent. The next day Evelyn Gray awoke with a headache and kept her tent. I had all I could do to prevent Kemper from prescribing for her. I did that myself, sitting beside her and testing her pulse for hours at a time, while Kemper took one of Gru's grains and went off into the mangroves and speared grunt and eels for a chowder which he said he knew how to concoct. Toward afternoon the pretty waitress felt much better, and I warned Kemper and Gru that we should sail for Black Bayou after dinner. Dinner was a mess, as usual, consisting of fried mullet and rice, and a sort of chowder in which the only ingredients I recognized were sections of crayfish. After we had finished and had withdrawn from the fire, Gru scraped every remaining shred of food into a kettle and went for it. To see him feed made me sick, so I rejoined Miss Gray and Kemper, who had found a green coconut and were alternately deriving nourishment from the milk inside it. Somehow or other, there seemed to me a certain levity about that performance, and it made me uncomfortable. But I managed to smile a rather sickly smile when they offered me a draught, and I took a pull at the milk. I don't exactly know why, because I don't like it. But the moon was up over the sea now, and the dusk was languorously balmy, and I didn't care to leave those two drinking milk out of the same coconut under a tropic moon. Not that my interest in Evelyn Gray was other than scientific, but after all, it was I who had discovered her. We sailed as soon as Gru, gobbling and snuffling, had cleaned up the last crumb of food. Kemper blandly offered to take Miss Gray into his boat, saying that he feared my boat was overcrowded, what with the paraphernalia, the folding cages, Gru, Miss Gray, and myself. I sat on that suggestion, but offered to take my own tiller and lend him Gru. He couldn't wriggle out of it, seeing that his alleged motive had been the overcrowding of my boat, but he looked rather sick when Gru went aboard his boat. As for me, I hoisted sail with something so near to a chuckle that it surprised me, and I looked at Evelyn Gray to see whether she had noticed the unseemly symptom. Apparently she had not. She sat forward, her eyes fixed soulfully upon the moon. Had I been dedicated to any profession except a scientific one, but let that pass. Gru, in Kemper's sailboat, led, and my boat followed out into the silvery and purple dusk, now all sparkling under the high luster of the moon. Dimly I saw vast rafts of wild duck part and swim leisurely away to port and starboard, leaving a glittering lane of water for us to sail through. Into the scintillant night from the sea sprang mullet, silvery, quivering, falling back into the wash with a splash. Here and there in the moonlight steered ominous black triangles, circling us, leading us, sheeting across bow and flashing wake, all phosphorescent with lambent sea fire, the fins of great sharks. "You need have no fear," I said to the pretty waitress. She said nothing. "Of course, if you are afraid," I added, "perhaps you might care to change your seat." There was no room in the stern where I sat. "Do you think there is any danger?" she asked. "From sharks?" "Yes." "Reaching up and biting you?" "Yes." "Oh, I don't really suppose there is," I said, managing to convey the idea, I am ashamed to say, that the catastrophe was a possibility. She came over and seated herself beside me. I was very much ashamed of myself, but I could not repress a triumphant glance ahead at the other boat, where Kemper sat huddled forward, evidently bored to extinction. Every now and then I could see him turn and crane his neck, as though in an effort to distinguish what was going on in our boat. There was nothing going on, absolutely nothing. The moon was magnificent, and I think the pretty waitress must have been a little tired, for her head drooped and nodded at moments, even while I was talking to her about a specimen of Euplectilla speciosa, on which I had written a monograph. So she must have been really tired, for the subject was interesting. "You won't incommode my operations with sheet and tiller," I said to her kindly, "if you care to rest your head against my shoulder." Evidently she was very tired, for she did so, and closed her eyes. After a while, fearing that she might fall over backward into the sea, but let that pass, I don't know whether or not Kemper could distinguish anything aboard our boat. He craned his head enough to twist it off his neck. To be so utterly, so blindly devoted to science is a great safeguard for a man. Single-mindedness, however, need not induce atrophy of every humane impulse. I drew the pretty waitress closer. Not that the night was cold, but it might become so. Changes in the tropics come swiftly. It is well to be prepared. Her cheek felt very soft against my shoulder. There seemed to be a faint perfume about her hair. It really was odd how subtly fragrant she seemed to be, almost, perhaps, a matter of scientific interest. Her hands did not seem to be chilled. They did seem unusually smooth and soft. I said to her, "When at home, I suppose your mother tucks you in, doesn't she?" "Yes," she nodded sleepily. "And what does she do then?" said I, with something of that ponderous playfulness with which I make scientific jokes at a meeting of the Bronx Anthropological Association when I preside. "She kisses me and turns out the light," said Evelyn Gray innocently. I don't know how much Kemper could distinguish. He kept dodging about and twisting his head until I really thought it would come off, unless it had been screwed on like the top of a piano stool. A few minutes later he fired his pistol twice, and Evelyn sat up. I never knew why he fired. He never offered any explanation. Toward midnight I could hear the roar of breakers on our starboard bow. Evelyn heard them too, and sat up inquiringly. "Gru has found the inlet to Black Bayou, I suppose," said I. And it proved to be the case, for, with the surf thundering on either hand, we sailed into a smoothly flowing inlet through which the flood tide was running between high dunes, all sparkling in the moonlight and crowned with shadowy palms. Occasionally I heard noises ahead of us from the other boat, as though Kemper was trying to converse with us, but as his apropos was as unintelligible as it was inopportune, I pretended not to hear him. Besides, I had all I could do to maneuver the tiller and prevent Evelyn Gray from falling off backward into the bayou. Besides, it is not customary to converse with the man at the helm. After a while, during which I seemed to distinguish in Kemper's voice a quality that rhymes with his name, his tones varied through phases all the way from irony to exasperation. After a while he gave it up and took to singing. There was a moon, and I suppose he thought he had a voice. It didn't strike me so. After several somewhat melancholy songs, he let off with his pistol 2 or 3 times and then subsided into silence. I didn't care. Neither his songs nor his shots interrupted, but let that pass also. We were now sailing into the forest through pool after pool of interminable lagoons, startling into unseen and clattering flight hundreds of waterfowl. I could feel the wind from their whistling wings in the darkness as they drove by us out to sea. It seemed to startle the pretty waitress. It is a solemn thing to be responsible for a pretty girl's peace of mind. I reassured her continually, perhaps a trifle nervously. But there were no more pistol shots. Perhaps Kemper had used up his cartridges. We were still drifting along under drooping sails, borne inland almost entirely by the tide, when the first pale, watery grey light streaked the east. When it grew a little lighter, Evelyn sat up, all danger of sharks being over. Also, I could begin to see what was going on in the other boat, which was nothing remarkable. Kemper slumped against the mast, his head turned in our direction. Gru sat at the helm, motionless, his tattered straw hat sagging on his neck. When the sun rose, I called out cheerily to Kemper, asking him how he had passed the night. Evelyn also raised her head, pausing while bringing her disordered hair under discipline to listen to his reply. But he merely mumbled something. Perhaps he was still sleepy. As for me, I felt exceedingly well, and when Gru turned his craft inshore I did so too, and when, under the overhanging foliage of the forest, the nose of my boat grated on the sand, I rose and crossed the deck with a step distinctly frolicsome. Kemper seemed distant and glum. Evelyn Gray spoke to him shyly now and then, and I noticed she looked at him only when he was gazing elsewhere than at her. She had a funny, conciliatory air with him, half ashamed, partly humorous and amused, as though something about Kemper's sulky ill-humor was continually making tiny inroads on her gravity. Some mullet had jumped into the two boats, half a dozen during our moonlight voyage, and these were now being fried with rice for us by Gru. Lord, how I hated to eat them. After we had finished breakfast, Gru, as usual, did everything to the remainder except to get into the frying pan with both feet, and, as usual, he sickened me. When he'd cleaned up everything, I sent him off into the forest to find a dry shell mound for camping purposes. Then I made fast both boats, and Kemper and I carried ashore our paraphernalia, spare batterie de cuisine, firearms, fishing tackle, spears, harpoons, grains, oars, sails, spars, folding cage, everything with which a strictly scientific expedition is usually burdened. Evelyn was washing her face in the crystal waters of a branch that flowed into the lagoon from under the live oaks. She looked very pretty doing it, like a naiad or dryad scrubbing away at her forest toilet. It was, in fact, such a pretty spectacle that I was going over to sit beside her while she did it, but Kemper started just what I was going to do, and I turned away. Some men invariably do the wrong thing, but a handsome man doesn't last long with a pretty girl. I was thinking of this as I stood contemplating an alligator slide, which Gru came back saying that the shore on which we had landed was the termination of a shell mound, and that it was the only dry place he had found. So I bade him pitch our tents a few feet back from the shore, and stood watching him while he did so, one eye reverting occasionally to Evelyn Gray and Kemper. They were both seated cross-legged beside the branch, and they seemed to be talking a great deal and rather earnestly. I couldn't quite understand what they found to talk about so earnestly and volubly all of a sudden, inasmuch as they had heretofore exchanged very few observations during a most brief and formal acquaintance, dating only from sundown the day before. Gru set up our 3 tents, carried the luggage inland, and then hung about for a while until the last shadow of a vulture swept across the trees. I never saw such an indescribable expression on a human face as I saw on Gru's as he looked up at the huge, unclean bird. His vitreous eyes fairly glittered, the corners of his mouth quivered and grew wet, and to my astonishment he seemed to emit a low mewing noise. "What the devil are you doing?" I said impulsively, and in my amazement and disgust. He looked at me, his eyes still glittering, the corners of his mouth still wet, but the curious sounds had ceased. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. I thought you spoke." I didn't know what else to say. He made no reply. Once, when I had partly turned my head, I was aware that he was warily turning his to look at the vulture, which had alighted heavily on the ground near the entrails and heads of the mullet, where he had cast them on the dead leaves. I walked over to where Evelyn Gray and Kemper sat so busily conversing, and their volubility ceased as they glanced up and saw me approaching, which phenomenon both perplexed and displeased me. I said, "This is the Black Bayou Forest, and we have the most serious business of our lives before us. Suppose you and I start out, Kemper, and see if there are any traces of what we are after in the neighborhood of our camp." "Do you think it's safe to leave Miss Gray alone in camp?" he asked gravely. I hadn't thought of that. "No, of course not," I said. "Gru can stay." "I don't need anybody," she said quickly. "Anyway, I'm rather afraid of Gru." "Afraid of Gru?" I repeated. Not exactly afraid, but he's unpleasant." "I'll remain with Miss Gray," said Kemper politely. "Oh," she exclaimed, "I couldn't ask that. It is true that I feel a little tired and nervous, but I can go with you and Mr. Smith and Grew." I surveyed Kemper in cold perplexity. As chief of the expedition, I couldn't very well offer to remain with Evelyn Gray, but I didn't propose that Kemper should either. "Take Grew," he suggested, "and look about the woods for a while. Perhaps after dinner Miss Gray may feel sufficiently rested to join us." "I am sure," she said, "that a few hours' rest in camp will set me on my feet. All I need is rest. I didn't sleep very soundly last night." I felt myself growing red, and I looked away from them both. "Oh," said Kemper in apparent surprise, "I thought you had slept soundly all night long." "Nobody," said I, "could have slept very pleasantly during that musical performance of yours." "Were you singing?" she asked innocently of Kemper. "He was singing when he wasn't firing off his pistol," I remarked. "No wonder you couldn't sleep with any satisfaction to yourself." Grew had disappeared into the forest. I stood watching for him to come out again. After a few minutes I heard a furious but distant noise of flapping. The others also heard it, and we listened in silence, wondering what it was. "It's Grew killing something," faltered Evelyn Gray, turning a trifle pale. "Confound it!" I exclaimed. "I'm going to stop that right now." Kemper rose and followed me as I started for the woods, but as we passed the beached boats, Grew appeared from among the trees. "Where have you been?" I demanded. "In the woods." "Doing what?" "Nothing." There was a bit of down here and there clinging to his cotton shirt and trousers, and one had caught and stuck at the corner of his mouth. "See here, Grew," I said, "I don't want you to kill any birds except for camp purposes. Why do you try to catch and kill birds?" "I don't." I stared at the man, and he stared back at me out of his glassy eyes. "You mean to say that you don't, somehow or other, manage to catch and kill birds?" "No, I don't." There was nothing further for me to say unless I gave him the lie. I didn't care to do that, needing his services. Evelyn Gray had come up to join us. There was a brief silence. We all stood looking at Grew, and he looked back at us out of his pale, washed-out, and unblinking eyes. "Grew," I said, "I haven't yet explained to you the object of this expedition to Black Bayou. Now I'll tell you what I want. But first, let me ask you a question or two. You know the Black Bayou forest, don't you?" "Yes." "Did you ever see anything unusual in these forests?" "No." "Are you sure?" The man stared at us, one after another. Then he said, "What are you looking for in Black Bayou?" "Something very curious, very strange, very unusual. So strange and unusual, in fact, that the Great Zoological Society of the Bronx in New York has sent me down here at the head of this expedition to search the forests of Black Bayou." "For what?" he demanded in a dull, accentless voice. "For a totally new species of human being, Grew. I wish to catch one and take it back to New York in that folding cage." His green eyes had grown narrow, as though sun-dazzled. Kemper had stepped behind us into the woods, and was now busy setting up the folding cage. Grew remained motionless. "I am going to offer you," I said, "the sum of $1,000 in gold, if you can guide us to a spot where we may see this hitherto unknown species, a creature which is apparently a man, but which has, in the back of his head, a third eye." I paused in amazement. Grew's cheeks had suddenly puffed out and were quivering, and from the corners of his slitted mouth he was emitting a whimpering sound, like the noise made by a low-circling pigeon. "Grew," I cried, What's the matter with you?" "What is he doing?" screamed Gru, quivering from head to foot, but not turning around. "Who?" I cried. "The man behind me." "Professor Kemper? He's setting up the folding cage." With a screech that raised my hair, Gru whipped out his murderous knife and hurled himself backward at Kemper. But the latter shrank aside behind the partly erected cage, and Gru whirled around, snarling, hacking, and even biting at the wood frame and steel bars. And then occurred a thing so horrid that it sickened me to the pit of my stomach. For the man's sagging straw hat had fallen off, and there, in the back of his head, through the coarse, black, ratty hair, I saw a glassy eye glaring at me. "Kemper!" I shouted. "He's got a third eye! He's one of them! Knock him flat with your rifle stock!" And I seized a shotgun from the top of the baggage bundle on the ground beside me and leaped at Gru, aiming a terrific blow at him. But the glassy eye in the back of his head was watching me between the clotted strands of hair, and he dodged both Kemper and me, swinging his heavy knife in circles and glaring at us both out of the front and back of his head. Kemper seized him by his arm, but Gru's shirt came off, and I saw his entire body was as furry as an ape's. And all the while he was snapping at us and leaping hither and thither to avoid our blows. And from the corners of his puffed cheeks he whined and whimpered and mewed through the saliva foam. "Keep him from the water," I panted, following him with the clubbed shotgun, and as I advanced I almost stepped on a soiled heap of foulness, the dead buzzard which he had caught and worried to death with his teeth. Suddenly he threw his knife at my head, hurling it backward, dodged, screeched, and bounded by me toward the shore of the lagoon, where the pretty waitress was standing petrified. For one moment I thought he had her, but she picked up her skirts, ran for the nearest boat, and seized a harpoon. And in his fierce eagerness to catch her, he leaped clear over the boat and fell with a splash into the lagoon. As Kemper and I sprang aboard and looked over into the water, we could see him going down out of reach of a harpoon, and his body seemed to be silver-plated, flashing and glittering like a burnished eel, so completely did the skin of air envelop him, held there by the fur that covered him. And as he rested for a moment on the bottom, deep down through the clear waters of the lagoon where he lay prone, I could see, as the current stirred his long black hair, the third eye looking up at us, glassy, unwinking, horrible. A bubble or two, like globules of quicksilver, were detached from the burnished skin of air that clothed him, and he came glittering upward. Suddenly there was a flash, a flurrying cloud of blue mud, and Gru was gone. After a long while, I turned around in the muteness of my despair, and slowly froze. For the pretty waitress, becomingly pale, was gathered in Kemper's arms, her cheek against his shoulder. Neither seemed to be aware of me. "Darling," he said in the imbecile voice of a man in love, "why do you tremble so when I am here to protect you? Don't you love and trust me?" "Oh, yes," she sighed, pressing her cheek closer to his shoulder. I shoved my hands into my pockets, passed them without noticing them, and stepped ashore. And there I sat down under a tree, with my back toward them, all alone and face to face with the greatest grief of my life. But which it was, the loss of her or the loss of Gru, I had not yet made up my mind. The End of The Third Eye. The Spectre of Doom by Bram Stoker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Spectre of Doom by Bram Stoker. Recording by Mark Nelson. Far away, there is a place known as the country under the sunset. Time there goes on much as it does here. Once it had been a beautiful land, and there had been love and reverence towards the king, but this was no more. No longer was there perfect peace. The people of the country under the sunset had become more selfish and more greedy, and had tried to grasp all they could for themselves. There were some very rich, and there were many very poor. Most of the beautiful gardens in the land were laid to waste. Houses had grown up close around the king's palace, and in some of these dwelt many persons who could only afford to pay for part of a house. All the beautiful country was sadly changed, and changed was the life of the dwellers in it. The spirits that guarded the land were very, very sad. Their great white shadowy wings drooped as they stood at their posts at the portals of the land. They hid their faces, and their eyes were dim with continuous weeping, so that they heeded not if any evil thing went by them. They tried to make the people think of their evil-doing, but they could not leave their posts, and the people heard their moaning in the night season, and said, "Listen to the sighing of the breeze, how sweet it is." So it is ever with us also, that when we hear the wind sighing and moaning and sobbing round our houses in the lonely nights, we do not think that our angels may be sorrowing for our misdeeds, but only that there is a storm coming. The angels wept evermore, and they felt the sorrow of numbness, for though they could speak, those they spoke to would not hear. Whilst the people laughed at the idea of giants, there was one old man who shook his head, and made answer to them when he heard them, and said, "Death has many children, and there are giants in the marshes still. You may not see them, perhaps, but they are there, and the only bulwark of safety is in a land of patient, faithful hearts." The name of this good old man was Noel, and he lived in a house built of great blocks of stone in the middle of a wild place far from the city. In the city there were many great old houses, story upon story high, and in these houses lived much poor people. The higher you went up the great steep stairs, the poorer were the people that lived there, so that in the garrets were some so poor that when the morning came they did not know whether they should have anything to eat the whole long day. This was very, very sad, and gentle children would have wept if they had seen their pain. In one of these garrets there lived all alone a little maiden called Zaya. She was an orphan, for her father had died many years before, and her poor mother, who had toiled long and wearily for her dear little daughter, her only child, had died also not long since. Poor little Zaya had wept so bitterly when she saw her dear mother lying dead, and she had been so sad and sorry for a long time, that she quite forgot that she had no means of living. However, the poor people who lived in the house had given her part of their own food, so that she did not starve. Then, after a while, she had tried to work for herself and earn her own living. Her mother had taught her to make flowers out of paper, so she made a lot of flowers, and when she had a full basket, she took them into the street and sold them. She made flowers of many kinds, roses and lilies and violets and snowdrops and primroses and mignonette and many beautiful sweet flowers that only grow in the country under the sunset. Some of them she could make without any pattern, but others she could not. So when she wanted a pattern, she took her basket of paper and scissors, and paste and brushes, and all the things she used, and went into the garden which a kind lady owned, where there grew many beautiful flowers. There she sat down and worked away, looking at the flowers she wanted. Sometimes she was very sad, and her tears fell thick and fast as she thought of her dear dead mother. Often she seemed to feel that her mother was looking down at her, and to see her tender smile in the sunshine on the water. Then her heart was glad, and she sang so sweetly that the birds came around her and stopped their own singing to listen to her. She and the birds grew great friends, and sometimes when she had sung a song they would all cry out together, as they sat round her in a ring, in a few notes that seemed to say quite plainly, "Sing to us again! Sing to us again!" So she would sing again. Then she would ask them to sing, and they would sing till there was quite a concert. After a while, the birds knew her so well that they would come into her room, and they even built their nests there, and they followed her wherever she went. The people used to say, "Look at the girl with the birds. She must be half a bird herself, for see how the birds know and love her." From so many people coming to say things like this, some silly people actually believed that she was partly a bird, and they shook their heads when wise people laughed at them and said, "Indeed she must be. Listen to her singing. Her voice is sweeter even than the birds." So a nickname was applied to her, and naughty boys called it after her in the street, and the nickname was Big Bird. But Zaya did not mind the name, and although often naughty boys said it to her, meaning to cause her pain, she did not dislike it, but on the contrary, for she so gloried in the love and trust of her little sweet-voiced pets that she wished to be thought like them. Indeed, it would be well for some naughty little boys and girls if they were as good and harmless as the little birds that worked all day long for their helpless baby birds, building nests and bringing food, and sitting so patiently hatching their little speckled eggs. One evening, Zaya sat alone in her garret, very sad and lonely. It was a lovely summer's evening, and she sat in the window looking out over the city. She could see over the many streets towards the great cathedral, whose spire towered aloft into the sky, higher by far even than the great tower of the king's palace. There was hardly a breath of wind, and the smoke went up straight from the chimneys, getting fainter and fainter till it was lost altogether. Zaya was very sad. For the first time for many days, her birds were all away from her at once, and she did not know where they had gone. It seemed to her as if they had deserted her, and she was so lonely, poor little maid, that she wept bitter tears. She was thinking of the story which long ago her dead mother had told her, how Prince Zephyr had slain the giant, and she wondered what the prince was like, and thought how happy the people must have been when Zephyr and Bluebell were king and queen. Then she wondered if there were any hungry children in those good days, and if indeed, as the people said, there were no more giants. So she thought and thought as she went on with her work before the open window. Presently she looked up from her work and gazed across the city. There she saw a terrible thing, something so terrible that she gave a low cry of fear and wonder, and leaned out of the window, shading her eyes with her hand to see more clearly. In the sky beyond the city she saw a vast shadowy form with its arms raised. It was shrouded in a great misty robe that covered it, fading away into air so that she could only see the face and the grim spectral hands. The form was so mighty that the city below it seemed like a child's toy. It was still far off the city. The little maid's heart seemed to stand still with fear as she thought to herself, "The giants, then, are not dead. This is another of them." Quickly she ran down the high stairs and out into the street. There she saw some people and cried to them, "Look, look, the giant, the giant!" and pointed towards the form which she still saw moving slowly onwards to the city. The people looked up, but they could not see anything, and they laughed and said, "The child is mad." Then poor little Zaya was more than ever frightened, and ran down the street crying out still, "Look, look, the giant, the giant!" But no one heeded her, and all said, "The child is mad," and they went on their own ways. Then the naughty boys came around her and cried out, "Big Bird has lost her mates. She sees a bigger bird in the sky, and she wants it." And they made rhymes about her and sang them as they danced round. Zaya ran away from them, and she hurried right through the city and out into the country beyond it, for she still saw the great form before her in the air. As she went on, and got nearer and nearer to the giant, it grew a little darker. She could see only the clouds, but still there was visible the form of a giant hanging dimly in the air. A cold mist closed around her as the giant appeared to come onwards towards her. Then she thought of all the poor people in the city, and she hoped that the giant would spare them, and she knelt down before him and lifted up her hands appealingly and cried aloud, "O great giant, spare them, spare them!" But the giant moved onwards, still as though he never heard. She cried aloud all the more, "O great giant, spare them, spare them!" And she bowed down her head and wept, and the giant still, though very slowly, moved onwards towards the city. There was an old man not far off, standing at the door of a small house built of great stones, but the little maid saw him not. His face wore a look of fear and wonder, and when he saw the child kneel and raise her hands, he drew nigh and listened to her voice. When he heard her say, "O great giant," he murmured to himself, "It is then even as I feared. There are more giants, and truly this is another." He looked upwards, but he saw nothing, and he murmured again, "I see not, yet this child can see, and yet I feared, for something told me that there was danger. Truly, knowledge is blinder than innocence." The little maid, still not knowing there was any human being near her, cried out again, with a great cry of anguish, "Oh, do not, great giant, do them harm! If someone must suffer, let it be me! Take me! I am willing to die, but spare them, great giant, and do with me even as thou wilt." But the giant heeded not. And Noel, for he was the old man, felt his eyes fill with tears, and he said to himself, "O noble child, how brave she is! She would sacrifice herself." And coming closer to her, he put his hand upon her head. Zaya, who was again bowing her head, started and looked round when she felt the touch. However, when she saw that it was Noel, she was comforted, for she knew how wise and good he was, and felt that if any person could help her, he could. So she clung to him and hid her face in his breast, and he stroked her hair and comforted her. But still he could see nothing. The cold mist swept by, and when Zaya looked up, she saw that the giant had passed by, and was moving onwards to the city. "Come with me, my child," said the old man, and the two arose and went into the dwelling built of great stones. When Zaya entered, she started, for lo, the inside was a tomb. The old man felt her shudder, for he still held her close to him, and he said, "Weep not, little one, and fear not. This place reminds me and all who enter it that to the tomb we must all come at the last. Fear it not, for it has grown to be a cheerful home to me." Then the little maid was comforted, and began to examine all around her more closely. She saw all sorts of curious instruments, and many strange and many common herbs and simples hung to dry in bunches on the walls. The old man watched her in silence till her fear was gone, and then he said, "My child, saw you the features of the giant as he passed?" She answered, "Yes." "Can you describe his face and form to me?" he asked again. Whereupon she began to tell him all that she had seen, how the giant was so great that all the sky seemed filled, how the great arms were outspread, veiled in his robe, till far away the shroud was lost in air, how the face was that of a strong man, pitiless, yet without malice, and that the eyes were blind. The old man shuddered as he heard, for he knew that the giant was a very terrible one, and his heart wept for the doomed city where so many would perish in the midst of their sin. They determined to go forth and warn again the doomed people, and making no delay, the old man and the little maid hurried towards the city. As they left the small house, Zaya saw the giant before them, moving still towards the city. They hurried on, and when they had passed through the cold mist, Zaya looked back and saw the giant behind them. Presently they came to the city. It was a strange sight to see that old man and the little maid flying to tell the people of the terrible plague that was coming upon them. The old man's long white beard and hair and the child's golden locks were swept behind them in the wind, so quick they came. The faces of both were white as death. Behind them, seen only to the eyes of the pure-hearted little maid when she looked back, came ever onwards at slow pace the spectral giant that hung a dark shadow in the evening air. But those in the city never saw the giant, and when the old man and the little maid warned them, still they heeded not, but scoffed and jeered at them, and said, "Tush! There are no giants now!" And they went on their way, laughing and jeering. Then the old man came and stood on a raised place amongst them, on the lowest step of the great fountain, with the little maid by his side, and he spake thus: "O people, dwellers in this land, be warned in time. This pure-hearted child, round whose sweet innocence even the little birds that fear men and women gather in peace, has this night seen in the sky the form of a giant that advances ever onwards menacingly to our city. Believe, oh believe, and be warned, whilst ye may. To myself, even as to you, the sky is a blank, and yet see that I believe. For listen to me, all unknowing that another giant had invaded our land, I sat pensive in my dwelling, and, without cause or motive, there came into my heart a sudden fear for the safety of our city. I arose and looked north and south and east and west, and on high and on below, but never a sign of danger could I see. So I said to myself, mine eyes are dim with 100 years of watching and waiting, and so I cannot see. And yet, O people, dwellers in this land, though that century has dimmed mine outer eyes, still it has quickened mine inner eyes, the eyes of my soul. Again I went forth, and lo, this little maid knelt and implored a giant, unseen by me, to spare the city. But he heard her not, or, if he heard, answered her not, and she fell prone. So hither has come to warn you. Yonder, says the maid, he passes onward to the city. Oh, be warned in time!" Still the people heeded not, but they scoffed and jeered the more, and said, "Lo, the maid and the old man both are mad!" And they passed onwards to their homes, to dancing and feasting as before. Then the naughty boys came and mocked them, and said that Zaya had lost her birds and had gone mad, and they made songs and sang them as they danced round. Zaya was so sorely grieved for the poor people that she heeded not the cruel boys. Seeing that she did not heed them, some of them got still more rude and wicked, and they went a little way off and threw things at her and mocked her all the more. Then, sad of heart, the old man arose and took the little maid by the hand and brought her away into the wilderness, and lodged her with him in the house built with great stones. That night Zaya slept with the sweet smell of the drying herbs all around her, and the old man held her hand that she might have no fear. In the morning Zaya arose betimes and awoke the old man, who had fallen asleep in his chair. She went to the doorway and looked out, and then a thrill of gladness came upon her heart, for outside the door, as though waiting to see her, sat all her little birds, and many, many more. When the birds saw the little maid, they sang a few loud, joyous notes, and flew about foolishly for very joy, some of them fluttering their wings and looking so funny that she could not help laughing a little. When Noel and Zaya had eaten their frugal breakfast and given some to their little feathered friends, they set out with sorrowful hearts to visit the city, and to try once more to warn the people. The birds flew around them as they went, and to cheer them sang as joyously as they could, although their little hearts were heavy. As they walked, they saw before them the great shadowy giant, and he had now advanced to the very confines of the city. Once again they warned the people, and the great crowds came around them, but only mocked them more than ever, and naughty boys threw stones and sticks at the little birds and killed some of them. Poor Zaya wept bitterly, and Noel's heart was very sad. After a time, when they had moved from the fountain, Zaya looked up and started with joyous surprise, for the great shadowy giant was nowhere to be seen. She cried out in joy, and the people laughed and said, "Cunning child! She sees that we will not believe her, and she pretends that the giant has gone." They surrounded her, jeering, and some of them said, "Let us put her under the fountain and duck her, as a lesson to liars who would frighten us." Then they approached her with menaces. She clung close to Noel, who had looked terribly grave when she had said she did not see the giant any longer, and who was now as if in a dream, thinking. But at her touch he seemed to wake up, and he spoke sternly to the people and rebuked them. But they cried out on him also, and said that as he had aided Zaya in her lie, he should be ducked also, and they advanced closer to lay hands on them both. The hand of one who was a ringleader was already outstretched, when he gave a low cry and pressed his hand to his side. And, whilst the others turned to look at him in wonder, he cried out in great pain and screamed horribly. Even whilst the people looked, his face grew blacker and blacker, and he fell down before them, and writhed the while in pain, and then died. All the people screamed out in terror and ran away, crying aloud, "The giant! The giant! He is indeed amongst us!" They feared all the more that they could not see him. But before they could leave the marketplace, in the centre of which was the fountain, many fell dead, and there their corpses lay. There in the centre knelt the old man and the little maid, praying, and the birds sat perched around the fountain, mute and still, and there was no sound heard save the cries of the people far off. Then their wailing sounded louder and louder, for the giant, Plague, was amongst and around them, and there was no escaping, for it was now too late to fly. Alas! In the country under the sunset there was much weeping that day, and when the night came there was little sleep, for there was fear in some hearts and pain in others. None were still except the dead, who lay stark about the city, so still and lifeless that even the cold light of the moon and the shadows of the drifting clouds moving over them could not make them seem as though they lived. And for many a long day there was pain and grief and death in the country under the sunset. Noel and Zaya did all they could to help the poor people, but it was hard indeed to aid them, for the unseen giant was amongst them, wandering through the city to and fro, so that none could tell where next he would lay his ice-cold hand. Some people fled away out of the city, but it was little use, for go how they would and fly never so fast, they were still within the grasp of the unseen giant. Ever and anon he turned their warm hearts to ice with his breath and his touch, and they fell dead. Some, like those within the city, were spared, and of these some perished of hunger, and the rest crept sadly back to the city and lived or died amongst their friends. And it was all, oh, so sad, for there was nothing but grief and fear and weeping from morn till night. Now see how Zaya's little bird friends helped her in her need. They seemed to see the coming of the giant, when no one, not even the little maid herself, could see anything, and they managed to tell her when there was danger just as well as though they could talk. At first Noel and she went home every evening to the house built of great stones to sleep, and came again to the city in the morning and stayed with the poor sick people, comforting them and feeding them, and giving them medicine which Noel, from his great wisdom, knew would do them good. Thus they saved many precious human lives, and those who were rescued were very thankful, and henceforth, ever after, lived holier and more unselfish lives. After a few days, however, they found that the poor sick people needed help even more at night than in the day, so they came and lived in the city altogether, helping the stricken folk day and night. At the earliest dawn, Zaya would go forth to breathe the morning air, and there, just waked from sleep, would be her feathered friends waiting for her. They sang glad songs of joy, and came and perched on her shoulders and her head, and kissed her. Then, if she went to go towards any place where, during the night, the plague had laid his deadly hand, they would flutter before her, and try to impede her, and scream out in their own tongue, "Go back! Go back!" They pecked of her bread and drank of her cup before she touched them, and when there was danger, for the cold hand of the giant was placed everywhere, they would cry, "No, no!" and she would not touch the food or let anyone else do so. Often it happened that, even whilst it pecked at the bread or drank of the cup, a poor little bird would fall down and flutter its wings and die. But all they that died did so with a chirp of joy, looking at their little mistress, for whom they had gladly perished. Whenever the little birds found that the bread and the cup were pure and free from danger, they would look up at Zaya jauntily, and flap their wings and try to crow, and seemed so saucy that the poor sad little maid would smile. There was one old bird that always took a second and often a great many pecks at the bread when it was good, so that he got quite a hearty meal, and sometimes he would go on feeding till Zaya would shake her finger at him and say, "Greedy," and he would hop away as if he had done nothing. There was one other dear little bird, a robin with a breast as red as the sunset, that loved Zaya more than one can think. When he tried the food and found that it was safe to eat, he would take a little tiny piece in his bill and fly up and put it in her mouth. Every little bird that drank from Zaya's cup and found it good raised its head to say grace, and ever since then the little birds do the same, and they never forget to say their grace, as some thankless children do. Thus Noel and Zaya lived, although many around them died, and the giant still remained in the city. So many people died that one began to wonder that so many were left, for it was only when the town began to get thinned that people thought of the vast numbers that had lived in it. Poor little Zaya had got so pale and thin that she looked like a shadow, and Noel's form was bent more with the sufferings of a few weeks than it had been by his century of age. But although the two were weary and worn, they still kept on their good work of aiding the sick. One morning the old man was very weak, so weak that he could hardly stand. Zaya got frightened about him and said, "Are you ill, father?" For she always called him father now. He answered her in a voice, alas, hoarse and low, but very, very tender. "My child, I fear the end is coming. Take me home, that there I may die." At his words, Zaya gave a low cry and fell on her knees beside him, and buried her head in his bosom and wept bitterly, whilst she hugged him close. But she had little time for weeping, for the old man struggled up to his feet, and seeing that he wanted aid, she dried her tears and helped him. The old man took his staff, and with Zaya helping to support him, got as far as the fountain in the midst of the marketplace, and there, on the lowest step, he sank down as though exhausted. Zaya felt him grow cold as ice, and she knew that the chilly hand of the giant had been laid upon him. Then, without knowing why, she looked up to where she had last seen the giant, as Noel and she had stood beside the fountain. And lo, as she looked, holding Noel's hand, she saw the shadowy form of the terrible giant who had been so long invisible growing more and more clearly out of the clouds. His face was as stern as ever, and his eyes were still blind. Zaya cried to the giant, still holding Noel tightly by the hand, "Not him! Not him! Oh, mighty giant, not him! Not him!" And she bowed down her head and wept. There was such anguish in her heart that to the blind eyes of the shadowy giant came tears that fell like dew on the forehead of the old man. Noel spake to Zaya, "Grieve not, my child. I am glad that you see the giant again, for I have hope that he will leave our city free from woe. I am the last victim, and I gladly die." Then Zaya knelt to the giant and said, "Spare him! Oh, spare him, and take me! But spare him! Spare him!" The old man raised himself upon his elbow as he lay, and spake to her, "Grieve not, little one, and repine not. Sooth, I know that you would gladly give your life for mine, but we must give for the good of others that which is dearer to us than our lives. Bless you, my little one, and be good. Farewell, farewell." As he spake the last word, he grew cold as death, and his spirit passed away. Zaya knelt down and prayed, and when she looked up, she saw the shadowy giant moving away. The giant turned as he passed on, and Zaya saw that his blind eyes looked towards her as though he were trying to see. He raised the great shadowy arms, draped still in his shroud of mist, as though blessing her, and she thought that the wind that came by her moaning bore the echo of the words, "Innocence and devotion save the land." Presently she saw far off the great shadowy giant Plague moving away to the border of the land, and passing between the guardian spirits out through the portal into the deserts beyond forever. The End of The Spectre of Doom by Bram Stoker.